All right, hey guys, how's it going? I am joined here by Liam O'Mara, who is running for Congress as a Democrat in the 42nd District in California. How are you doing today?
Hey, good. Good to see you.
So your campaign reached out to me. They wanted to have us chat, I guess, about some of the issues you're running for in California, and I don't get a chance often to talk to people that are actually attempting to run for Congress. So yeah, I'm interested. What do you think what are the most important issues that your campaign is dealing with right now?
Well, there's a lot of national issues that I'm interested in, I'm trying to insert myself into several of those debates nationally. But in terms of issues in the area, it's really trying to get the incumbent out. He's been in there for 27 years, never holds a town hall, never speaks to anybody, and he's got some deeply reactionary views. So it's trying to basically shake things up, run things a little bit differently, and try and push this guy out.
So this is Ken Calvert, right?
Correct.
I looked at the polling data. It's been a long time. He won by quite a margin, right? It was over 10 points, I think, the last time the election.
The last one was by 7.
Oh, okay, 7 points. Okay.
But he has won by larger margins before and by smaller ones.
What are you guys planning on doing, I guess, differently this time around? Or not that you've been trying to unseat him or whatever, but how do you think you're going to make inroads there, I guess?
Well, there are a number of things that are a bit different here. First off, one of the models for me in the campaign that I'm hoping will be a little bit different there is I've taken kind of as a model one of the closest races that came to unseating him. Bill Hedrick came within 2 points, and Bill was a much more, I think, relatable character. He was much more of an ordinary guy, willing to go out there and talk to anybody about anything. And I have the same basic ethos. And I think in some ways a similar aesthetic, in the sense that I wasn't willing to kind of compromise who I am to run for politics, and neither did Bill, which I think a lot of independents can really respect. One of the things that's interesting is that Bill came so close to beating Calvert, and at the time the district was 45% Republican, with the number of Democrats about the same as it is now. The number of Democrats hasn't really changed, but the number of Republicans has fallen considerably. It's now only 38%. So what's been growing are those independents, the NPPs. And the idea there is to try to appeal to as many of them as possible.
In looking at kind of issues that target the group of independents that could lean either way, what do you think are the most clear-cut issues that you think you have an advantage on over a Republican incumbent?
Well, I think, realistically, if you address a lot of the topics right, we have an advantage on almost everything. I think the only one that plays really well to more conservative people in the district is going to be the immigration issue, which has been a hot button issue in the 42nd for quite some time, and I'm obviously not down with the whole xenophobia thing. On pretty much everything else, I think that if we flip the script on how it's normally discussed, I think we can make some serious inroads. So, for example, I tend to take a more economic focus on a lot of things, because more moderate conservative voters and civil libertarian voters have different concerns from typical Democrats. So if I can address a lot of policies in ways that, A, emphasize civil libertarian aspects of it, right? How to blah, 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 take more interference out of your life, this sort of thing. Or B, things that make selfish appeals to people. So I can save you a bunch of money on your health care and focus on that more for people. Because when it comes to the data, he has no argument, that can stand up. I can crush him on the facts. It's just a matter of how you message things. And I think that Democrats in general tend to do that poorly for this area.
Sure, I definitely don't disagree. As somebody who's debated immigration a lot, I definitely agree with that. The facts tend to fall on the side of the pro-immigration platform.
That one too. That one's just it's harder in the area because, okay, so I guess I look at it this way. The 42nd went for Trump by 12 points, which means it is not possible for a Democrat to win without appealing to some Trump voters.
For sure.
Now, a lot of Trump voters are going to be, let's be frank, more racist, xenophobic, right, nativist. Those are not people that you're going to sway. They're not going to vote Democrat no matter what. A lot of people, though, voted for Trump because of the economic populist message, the fact that he was reaching out to working class voters, the fact that he was saying, I understand your pain. Less than half of people in the Inland Empire are paid a living wage. Right? If you look at the data there, people have been looking at their lifestyles contracting, their options contracting. They're having a hard time making it. The cost of living keeps going up and salaries don't go up.
Mm-hmm.
And the Trump saying that he was listening resonated with people. I mean, he was dishonest about it, but that's a whole different issue. So if we can focus on those issues, I can try and pull some of those voters in.
Do you worry? So focusing on the immigration aspect. Hold on, I'm gonna mute something. Okay. So focusing on the immigration aspect. So how do you juggle, like, trying to say this polite way, how do you juggle appealing to the nativist Trump anti-immigration, maybe xenophobic population without alienating kind of like Democratic voters? Is that a challenge?
That's the thing. No, that's the thing. I'm not. Those are the people you're not going to reach.
You only focus on the economic side of things? You just let all the rest fall to the...
Well, for those voters, because not every person voting for Trump is doing it because they are racist.
I agree, yeah.
Plenty of them are, but not all of them. And the issue here is I'm not going to try to appeal to the people who are backing Trump specifically because they hate brown people or they hate Muslims or something. I'm going to push back against that hard. Mm-hmm. And if the immigration issue comes up, I'm not trying to focus on it a lot. When the immigration issue comes up, I will always come down on the side of the facts. And it doesn't matter if the study comes from the right or the left. It always supports immigration as an idea. Immigration is always a net benefit, and I'm not going to mince words on that. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to get those voters. But the people who voted for Trump because Trump said, I'm going to bring jobs back, I'm going to help you out, I'm going to put more money in your pocket, those are people who might listen to me. And there's plenty of people in the area. There's a lot of people have disliked Calvert for a long time because large portions of the Republican base in the area and the conservative independent base in the area lean civil libertarian. Which means some of the more traditional authoritarian, more kind of neocon-y type Republicans don't really appeal to them.
Gotcha.
So that gives me also some potential inroads.
When you talk about, so kind of like this focus on like economic populism, what kind of like policy positions are you kind of aiming at there?
Okay, so a simple fact is we are the richest country in the history of the world, and our living standards have been falling steadily for decades. Mm-hmm. We now rank somewhere between 16th and 17th in the world, and it's getting steadily worse every year. There are a lot of simple, basic things that people can relate to. So, for example, the lack of investment in infrastructure directly impacts people's lives in the area, grinding traffic, everything else like that. There's California has built far more prisons than schools in the last few decades. We're just not addressing a lot of basic needs. But tons of other ones are direct policy choices. We're choosing to keep people poorer, to keep wages lower. So, the trick here is to be able to explain why we've been in decline, to point to it and say, look, things are bad. This is what made Trump viable. Things are getting bad. People often don't quite understand why things are bad or how the economy is a very complex, nebulous sort of thing. But people have a sense that things aren't as good as they should be, and they're worrying about their children's future. So if I can say, well, look, if we take care of things like, okay, we are the only country in the world other than Papua New Guinea not to have paid family leave, which really dramatically impacts the earning potential of families. It keeps a lot more women out of the workforce and limits the time they can be in the workforce, et cetera, et cetera. Or you look at the fact that we pay twice as much as any comparable country for healthcare. Mm-hmm. Like out of our pockets, we spend twice as much, and yet we are the 35th healthiest people in the world. So we spend more to get less. I mean, our healthcare system is ranked by the World Health Organization as comparable to Tunisia's. No country in the developed world has anything close to the results that we have, and yet we're paying twice as much. So the issue for me with a lot of issues, things like that, people tend to attack the healthcare issue in moral terms when they're coming from the left. They'll talk about how healthcare is a right. We need to take care of more people. Yes, that's all very true. I agree with all of that. But those arguments aren't going to sway a lot of moderate conservatives or libertarian types. Mm-hmm. They're going to be like, so what? I don't care. I got mine. I got good insurance from my employer. I'm fine. So if you can tell them, okay, so you get insurance from your employer, right? That's cool. You like getting insurance, right? So what if we say your employer's paying $17,000 for your insurance, and it should only cost $7,000? And then switching then to my approach here is going to put $10,000 in your wallet. That's not a handout. It's your money. It's part of your salary. It's part of your compensation package that someone is wasting, and it could be yours.
So in looking at all these things, I mean, I obviously we probably agree on the policy issues for most of these things. How do you look in terms of like funding stuff? Because I mean, that's always like the challenge at the end, right? Is where does the money come from in the budget?
Yeah, it's always funny when people do that
Mhm.
because it's well, we can't afford to, I don't know, take care of people's health care, but we can certainly afford to,
Do massive
you
tax
know,
cuts for,
yeah, massive
yeah.
tax cuts for the rich, and bombing 8 countries at the same time, and all this other stuff. Like,
Hmm.
why? What do we get out of that? What do we get out of like a dozen aircraft carriers patrolling the world? We have 2 giant oceans. I mean, hello, there's plenty of money for that, but then they complain about these other things. So I get that.
Hmm.
But set this hypocrisy part aside. To me, again, it's a simple numbers game. If someone says, "How do you afford universal health care?" the simple question is, we're already paying for it, and we're actually paying much more for it. So simply changing the way the system is organized on the insurance side would save a tremendous amount of money directly. So it's not a question of like, how do you pay for it? It's already there. And then tons of other ones. I it's tricky in American political discourse because the right has done such a great job of turning the word tax into a dirty word and trying to get people to think that any discussion of taxes means that their costs go up.
Sure.
And that's simply not the case. I don't want to raise taxes on someone making 50 grand a year, 60 grand a year. I'd love to lower their tax burden. The taxes on the rich need to be higher. And there's actually already broad popular support for that in polls. Even Fox News polls show 70, 80% of people support higher taxes on the rich.
Hmm.
Yet the politicians aren't really to talk about it because the word is scary. So I want to try and use the position here, use the campaign to make some basic arguments for people. We know from the history of this, from our own history, and from examples all around the world, that higher taxes on the rich lead directly to greater investment in the real economy and higher wages for everyone else. And we can also show them that since we started doing massive tax cuts on the rich, look back at Reagan's tax cuts, which we did the rounds under Reagan, then we did the ones under W. Bush, and now under Trump. If you go back to the beginning under Reagan, right? Reagan cut taxes on the rich. That is the exact time when wages stopped growing for everyone else. They became stagnant and they have not kept up. So all of those years. So we're looking at 40 years of stagnant wages at the same time as these tax cuts on the rich. If you can try to simply explain the connection between those two things, it can kind of change the conversation on it a bit. Because realistically for me, I don't want government handouts. I don't want blah 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 free money or all that. I want people to have their own money. I want them to be able to earn more and keep more of their own money. And the simple fact is, the way we have organized the current tax system is screwing most people.
Um, when you look at like different ways to bring in revenue from wealthy people, I know that some of the Democratic candidates are kind of suggesting different things. So, for instance, Elizabeth Warren has like a wealth tax. I think she's talked about like a financial transaction tax, like kind of like a speculation tax. What kinds of I guess new taxes are you like in favor of for some of the wealthiest Americans? Like, what do you think are effective ways of raising revenue without discouraging good economic activity?
Right. Those are actually both good. And that's also an interesting question, too, because you're going to, well, is this going to discourage economic activity? That, again, gets to where, to me, one of the things that's consistently bothered me in the last few decades about Democratic politicians is how few of them are willing to engage directly on the economy.
Mm-hmm.
They cede that ground to Republicans, and Republicans are able to say, we're better for the markets, we're better for the economy. And then, of course, they conflate markets and the economy, which are not the same thing at all. But if we can actually engage directly on those issues, I think that they're winning ones for us. A wealth tax and an inheritance tax actually stimulates growth. When people just inherit vast amounts of money, they're encouraged to sit on it. When someone accumulates vast amounts of money, they're actually encouraged to sit on it. The economic logic is to do nothing at all, because you'll make more money if you do nothing at all. If there's a wealth tax on it, you're actually incentivized to work harder, to invest in your business and grow the business, because that's how you grow your wealth too. That's how we built great fortunes in the first place. And this is how we have built very competitive economies all around the world. Higher taxes on high earners did not discourage growth in any part of Europe. I mean, the Northern European countries have tended to have quite high taxes on the rich, and yet they have highly competitive markets. In fact, the Nordic countries are generally rated as more economically competitive than the US. They have freer economies too, and tons of, massive corporations. So it's not like it stops that kind of work. It actually helps to stimulate it. Speculation tax is a good one. Both Warren and Sanders have both talked about this. And one of the points I would like to make is that If you go back to the markets in the 1960s, and we were not poor in the 60s, we were on top of the world. If you go back to the markets in the 1960s, 90% of transactions taking place in the markets reflected the real economy. It was transactions based around companies that were actually doing things in the world, moving goods, building things, right? Things that actually affected the real economy of ordinary people. Today, 90% of transactions on the markets are speculation. They have no bearing at all on what's happening in the real world. It's just people saying, hey, I think this new whiz-bang company with this cool logo is going to be worth something. I'll do that. And then just bouncing the stocks back and forth, trying to like bet on what might be valuable at some point, but having no real bearing on the actual economy. It's one of the reasons we get so many like of these small startups being valued higher than like General Electric or something.
Sure. Wait, real quick. Can you restart your camera? It turned off for a second.
Yeah, it keeps actually cutting out. Yours has been completely stable, like frozen for a long time, and mine will go for a minute and then freeze completely.
Okay.
And I'm not sure what that is.
Yeah,
at all.
Sometimes it happens, but it's okay. I'm kind of curious on that. Wait, we don't have to get like too lost in the nitty gritty. Would you say that like, and I don't know how extreme to be on this. Do you think that like all derivative like capital markets are bad, or like when we look at like a startup, like say a startup happens, people overvalue it, angel investors or early investors come in and they pour a bunch of money into it. Is this like necessarily like a bad economic activity that you'd want to discourage, or?
No, but there are excesses to it. So it's a matter of, okay, so the way I look at it this way is the businesses, the corporations working on the markets, and the state and its regulators are supposed to work together. There's a bit of back and forth. If you leave either of them completely alone, if the state entirely dictates how things work, wildly inefficient, doesn't work. If the companies in the markets are entirely unregulated, it doesn't work either. It doesn't actually foster growth. There has to be some kind of balance between them where you're applying the right kinds of incentives. So, for example, a small tax on speculation tones down some of the excesses of speculation without actually stopping the activity, because the activity itself is going to happen anyway. It's fine. But if it's super cheap to do so, then anybody's going to sit around on their computer all day and just bounce something around and think that they're making money, but it's not actually doing anything. It's basically unproductive labor. It's not actually doing anything for the economy. So a very small tax slows that a little bit. I don't know if realistically we can get back to where we were in the 60s with 90% of it in the real economy. Things have changed too much, and a lot of our development really has to be at this point in new startups and high-tech type stuff. Really we need to be developing a 21st century economy anyway. So some of that stuff should be encouraged, but it's reached an excessive point and needs to be slowed down.
Okay. When you were talking about policies now, we're talking about things that are pretty national in scope, right? They affect the entirety of the United States. So I'm kind of curious, when you're running as like a congressman, how do you balance like your national interest versus like the unique challenges that you might have facing your district? Like how do you determine which issues you want to talk about more? So for instance, like I don't know how much like a financial transaction tax might be relevant to like the citizens that are living in the 42nd district of California. Do you have to tailor your message more specifically, or how do you choose like I guess which points to talk about?
It's actually a huge topic. There's a lot to that. So in some ways you have to change the way you're going to approach something. When you're talking about a big national issue, you have to find a way to say this is how it does affect you. So for example, a wealth tax is not going to affect a great number of people in the 42nd, directly, because it's relatively poor overall. The issue though is if you're going to talk about it, how does it affect wages here? How will it push up wages here? If you're talking about the whole speculation tax, what's that going to do? Well, it helps to bring the markets back in line a little bit with some of the real economy, and helps to change some of the emphasis back. And I'm trying to make the argument that we need to build up the real economy in the area. My district is actually fairly huge, like physically very large. It has 0 universities. It has 1 community college and a satellite campus for another community college. It has very few industries. It's mostly like shipping and warehousing, that sort of thing. We need to build up good jobs for people in the area. So if you take these big national policies that seem kind of abstract to people and you say, this is how we will encourage investment locally and bring jobs into this area, then that can help there. To the broader point you're making about national issues versus local issues. That's actually, in some ways, one of the interesting challenges of the campaign. People asked me initially, so why didn't you run for like a more local office or a
Yeah.
state office? And my answer is always twofold. One, a lot of people run for the House as a first step anyway. The incumbent did. He was a real estate developer and he went into Congress. So there's that. But the other is that's where my background is actually suited. I study national and international issues. So it's where I can actually make a real difference. And if I can be a voice there on these big policies and do it in such a way that it directly helps the people back in my district, I'm actually serving their interests. People often try to ask people running for Congress about very specific local issues. And the simple fact is that's not what a Congress critter does.
Mm-hmm.
They're not supposed to like affect where a traffic light goes in.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And they even have relatively little impact on even big things like the freeways. I mean, you can sometimes get grants or whatever for things like that, push things like that through, but it really is more of a thing that the counties and states work on, and then do some of that in collaboration with the federal government. So what I have to try and do is say, okay, these are the areas that I can talk on. Well, these are things that I can, actually push on, and then try to show them where it affects them.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Do you I should know this, but I don't. Are you do you know if other people are planning on running against you, or in this district is it like pretty competitive among other Democrats running like in the primary, or?
It sometimes is and sometimes not. It really varies. There's one other person who has announced and is running in the primary, but has so far done very few public events, raised almost nothing. She's not doing a lot of the work of the campaigning, but is actually in the primary. So we'll see how that goes. California, has those jungle primaries where, there's lots of people involved in them anyway.
Okay.
So it isn't like a primary within the party. So realistically, it's looking like there will be 3 candidates in the primary, and then the top 2 will go on to the general.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, so for the most part, without making it too personal myself, I think we align on a lot of kind of policy issues where I tend to avoid like the moral arguments on things like immigration, and I try to focus on the economic ones because I think those are resoundingly powerful. However, so you market yourself as an economic populist. Now, how do you respond to people? Generally, when I hear populism, I usually think economically of kind of isolationist policies, so things like tariffs or like protectionist ideas. Where do you fall in line with stuff like that? Like, are you generally like pro-tariff or pro-protecting certain industries? No,
not at all. It's tricky because I can understand the arguments there, but realistically, protectionism doesn't work. Tariffs always end up hurting consumers, businesses. They actually contract the real economy.
Yeah, it's a consumption tax, right?
That kind of like economic isolationism makes no sense to me at all. The populist element is, for me, the appeal to the populares, to think about the Latin, the people, like, people first. Like, how do we better help the economy of ordinary people? How do we better help someone afford to pay for their childcare, take care of their groceries, grow their economy, get higher wages, that sort of thing? That's what I'm talking about. Realistically, I have no problems with free trade. Trade is not the problem. The Germans have a higher living standard. The Nordic countries have a higher living standard, and they all have freer trade than we do. Right, they literally have freer trade, and the Germans, with an economy 1/7 the size of the United States, literally exports more than we do. Right, people like Trump are always talking about the trade deficit, and they're blaming China for it, like China's taking this or that, and China's not. We're buying it. The problem is us. It's our choices. It's what we're doing and our policy choices. The Germans have better structured their economy and the growth areas in their economy so they can compete, which means they can sell things. There are things that they do better than anybody else. That's what we need to be doing, is investing in our real economy, investing in our workers, investing in the industries of the future. That was how we built the middle class in the first place, and that's how all the other successful countries in the world are building themselves up. Complaining about the competition makes no sense to me. It's literally stupid. You're blaming them for doing a good job. The problem is you.
So I'm curious with the way that, because you keep using this term "real economy," are you okay with like America's transition to like a service economy, or the fact that we export a lot of, say, like financial services and whatnot, or would you like to see like a return to manufacturing, or do you not feel strongly aligned one way or another?
Honestly, I think it's. I'm not sure I like the way people generally put that, like a return to manufacturing. Realistically, the United States manufactures more now than we ever did before. We are still a manufacturing economy. We just do it mostly, it's more automated, so it employs fewer people. The movement into different sectors is not itself the problem. The fact that we've moved into a lot of financial services, I have no issues with that at all. But there are a lot of areas that we could better compete and take care of more people there. The fact that we're leaving more and more people with dead-end jobs, working multiple jobs in like fast food or something, that's not sustainable, especially since tons of jobs are going to be automated away. I mean, trying to restore manufacturing, as some people are putting it, like bring more jobs back, that it doesn't make sense. We're still manufacturing lots of stuff. We don't need as many people to do it, and we're going to need fewer and fewer and fewer people to do it. Eventually it's going to be like, just a bunch of robots and a dog to keep the rats out and the guy to feed the dog, and that'll be it. You don't need this stuff in there. And it's not just manufacturing. All these warehouse jobs, there'll be robots moving those packages around. Tons of clerical jobs, tons of administrative jobs. AI is going to be taking over tons of that. Tons of service sector jobs. Those are all going to start disappearing. A lot of studies are saying that based upon the technological and economic trends, 43% of American jobs are at risk of disappearing in the next few decades. And we're not planning for that. That's one of the things that bothers me. Education is a good part of that, preparing the workforce here, so better access to college, but also access to trade schools so people can learn to do things that aren't easily going to be automated away. This is one of the things that I think the system's a bit too rigid, but I like the fact that in the German education system, people are sorted by their choices and aptitudes and either heading off to trade school or heading off to university afterwards, and both are free. They're part of, like we already pay for K-12. It's the same basic system. It just extends outward to provide people good careers. Because not everyone needs to go to college, but everyone needs to be able to do something, to contribute, right? So people have to go off and become electricians, plumbers, this or that. You give them good training so they get good paying jobs doing it. We need to start thinking about how to do that, how better to prepare people for the workforce of the future, so that we're not just looking around as all the jobs go away and then like, oh, what do we do now? What do we do now? And of course, as job numbers go down, then the spending goes down. We are a consumer economy, then the entire thing starts to contract.
Sure. So Andrew Yang obviously talks a lot about this. When you talk about like automating a lot of jobs away and everything, are you pointing towards like a UBI type thing, or do you think complementary positions are going to open in the future that will keep people employed in services? Or
honestly, both. There are a lot of things that we will continue to create jobs. It's not going to go away. We're not going to like suddenly all just be sitting around. There will be tons of jobs, but we will eventually have to consider some way to tax the robots, because they're still going to be doing the work, and the work still produces economic value. And living in the society that has that value, that's doing that thing, should come with some basic benefit, like not starving to death. We will eventually have to do that. So I actually quite appreciate that he's in this race right now and is bringing that up, because it gets that conversation started on the national level. I think it's absolutely inevitable. And tons of test studies of this done over the last century, they've all been positive. They've all led to higher growth rates and more people working, not less. Because if you take care of those basic needs, suddenly people are able to do other things. They're able to spend, they're able to go out. If I've got enough to take care of, like, I mean, if I don't have to worry about paying for childcare or this or that, I don't have to worry about, like, I can't make my rent. Suddenly I can afford to go out to eat, right? Or buy another toy. And that actually stimulates growth overall, which leads also to more employment. So it's not like it's a bad idea in any way.
Do you think if we tax robots, we have to give them the right to vote? I'm sorry. Okay. Wait. Yeah. Hold on. Okay. Two questions I have for you. In terms of, so we've kind of talked about a little bit of the first, not much of the second. If you could choose like a really important domestic issue, do you think there's like an important domestic issue that we don't talk about enough, like in our national political discourse? Is there some big thing that you think like most people either aren't seeing or politicians aren't addressing enough?
There's actually quite a few. There's one that I want to raise the profile of, and one that does get talked about, but not quite enough and not well.
Mm-hmm.
The latter one is the climate change issue,
Yeah.
and that's a harder one in the area because I do live in a semi-rural district. In fact, that's one of the reasons the Discord and the Twitch stream is actually sort of complicated for me technically, aside from the fact that I'm on a Linux computer, so there's that. But where I live, I have no access to high-speed internet. It does not exist. My only internet is my phone because it's simply not available. So for years, I've not been able to keep up with that sort of thing.
Okay.
It's difficult to address a lot of issues like climate change to people in rural areas because they're not used to it coming up, and it can sound scary, and they start thinking, oh, the cost, how do you pay for this? Oh, this Green New Deal sounds scary expensive. So the trick for me, it comes back to the same kind of arguments I made before. How do you shift it around so that it directly affects them, or uses some of the logic that they would use? So if the Green New Deal is going to call for higher investment in a lot of different technical areas, you can point out, well, the U.S. used to be a world leader in tons of technical areas. We used to be the world leader in solar cell technology and in battery technology. Why is China the world leader in both? Could it be that they're investing in those areas and innovating and filing patents? Isn't that what we used to do as the most innovative capitalist economy in the world? Why can't we get back to that? I mean, the reason we have these things in the first place is the investments during the Cold War. Right? I mean, it's not like the state directed the economy. They simply provided the resources to different university R&D labs and and sponsored different projects like competitions. They put the money out there so that people could actually do the work and innovate, and that led to massive boom, the longest sustained economic boom in our history. And if we pitch the Green New Deal as the same kind of idea, as a solid investment in the American economy and in the American worker that will improve our quality of life, I think you can also get some attention there, because the simple fact is we're facing an existential challenge here. A few degrees up here and we'll have heat waves that will literally kill mammals that step outside. I mean, do we want large parts of the United States, and never mind the rest of the world, to become literally uninhabitable? And you think about the massive cascading extinctions that'll come from that. You wipe out a few insects, that kills a few mammals. Next thing you know, crops are failing all over the place, and we have massive starvation, civil wars.
Or relevant to people,
the
refugee crises. And
which again, this is an issue that comes up because a lot of people in the area are like, oh, no more immigrants. Well, sorry, buddy. There's a lot of them are going to be coming here, period. The climate change is going to make that inevitable. So we need to start working on how we can adapt to this sort of thing, because the simple fact is hundreds of millions of people are living in places that will not be livable at all. Yeah. They will have to escape those areas. So we have to grapple with the challenges there. The trick is, how do you win the argument? How do you convince people to care in the first place and not think of it as some airy abstraction? Oh, that's 50 years down the road and it only affects people in like Florida or something or whatever. I don't care. You have to make it real and vital and emotional for people. And that's one thing that I want to do, and one of the things I want to try to get a lot more people to do.
Yeah, one of the... sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say quickly, the other one that I want to try and push a bit more, I think, is an area of potential common ground between the more conservative and liberal voters there, and that's clean elections. The commitment to get the big money out of politics. We should not be allowing corporations and the rich to be buying elections. I mean, Trump ran on draining the swamp. We all know he was lying. You only have to look at his cabinet to see he was lying. He brought all the lobbyists with him still, but he said it, and people loved it. And poll after poll shows that both conservative and liberal voters do not like the influence of the super rich in our politics. So trying to draw attention to that and say, hey, look, we have to be better than this. This is a problem, and it's a problem on all sides. It's one of the areas where I can actually admit there's tons of problems in the Democratic Party. There's tons of Democrats I would consider wildly corrupt that vote totally in line with corporate interests. They should be wearing like NASCAR jackets with stickers that show who owns them and tells them what to do, because it's not us, it's not the voters.
Sure.
And if we can try and win people over on that issue because it is so broadly felt, I mean, I think it's a winning issue.
Okay. So on both of those, okay. So on the first one, the climate change. Personally, I feel like as an international issue, behind maybe nuclear weapons and things related to say like Iran, I would say climate change is like the most important issue facing the world. But
I agree.
I talk about it almost never because it seems like one of those issues that's so impossible to get somebody personally invested in that it just seems like a really set like oh man, and I don't mean to pull. This is kind of a Republican talking card, but as somebody, so I'm 30. I think you've got a couple years on me. But growing up, and maybe it was even maybe you heard a lot of this too. I remember even for me growing up, I would hear like in 5 years the ice caps are going to be melted. In 10 years, the planet is going to be 20 degrees cooler or warmer, or whatever. That all of this horrible stuff is going to happen, and it hasn't. It seems like it's really hard to get people like actually motivated into making real sacrifices for climate change related stuff. I do agree that like innovation and new technology and all of that is definitely important, but sometimes it feels like we're waiting for like the magical innovation that'll kind of like bail us out and don't want to acknowledge maybe the reality that we probably do have to make some consumption changes. Like I don't know if we can fly as much or drive as much or consume energy in the way we do now and still get to like a carbon neutral state, for the country without significant technological innovation that doesn't exist right now.
Okay, so here's the way I'd approach that, and there's two different aspects to this. One, the predictions issue, and this comes up a lot from the right. Oh, they said this was going to happen, and it didn't. Well, the simple fact is it actually did. Tons of that ice is gone. A huge amount of sea ice is gone, and the rate of sea level rise has been steadily going up. And so you said it's actually nice that you said that. You said 20 degrees warmer. So if you look back and you just go back like 10, 20 years, right? Go back 10 years and look at like the average temperature where I live, all right? And in the summer months, it was in the 80s, right? In the August, the averages were in the 80s. Today, it's in the hundreds. And I have tons of 105 days, 106 days. That's a 20-degree difference in 10 years. The average temperature in many parts of the country has gone up, but things like that move slowly. They move gradually, and you forget that things were actually different. So if you can try to make that real and say, it's a lot hotter than it was when you were a kid, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, well, I'm not sure. Well, here's the numbers and take a look at this, and it's a lot hotter.
Yeah, I think the people that feel this,
effects.
The people that feel this the worst are like I have friends in Washington or people in London. I think like people that live in these areas where it got kind of warm in the summer, but now it's getting into like the 80s, and a lot of these buildings have no air conditioner, and it is like or in London like in the 30s, I guess, or the high 20s, and it's like really really hard to deal with it because they don't actually have like air conditioning stuff built out into their area.
Right. And even areas that haven't had as severe a warming in much of the year as other parts of the country. I mean, my partner's from northern New York, where it gets super cold large parts of the year, and they're getting temperatures in the 90s in large parts of the summer now, and that's unusual. That didn't used to happen, and it's not set up for that. And you are getting like heat strokes and people getting sick from that. So if you can try to make some of that at least realer for people. But the bigger point I want to hit on here is you talked about sacrifice, and a lot of people talk about sacrifice when it comes to this. We have to change this or that, and I think that also gives into a right-wing talking point. I honestly don't think we need to. I think it's more a matter of innovation and change in the way that we approach some things. So do we need to stop driving? No, we just need to drive things that aren't polluting. And that technology already exists. Do we need to not have air conditioning? No, we need to use air conditioning that uses less energy, and we need to move on to a clean energy power grid. If we have our energy coming all from like solar and wind and things like that, geothermal, tons of the renewable energies that are carbon neutral, then does your air conditioning matter? No, today it does, but it's not going to if it's all solar.
I'm curious, do you have a strong stance on nuclear power? Do you care one way or another, or?
I don't have very strong feelings on it, but I dislike it. I always have, largely because there's no way to deal effectively with the waste. And the bigger issue, I think, for me is that it's not economically viable. It always costs a tremendous amount of money for what it generates. It relied upon significant subsidies. And there's no good reason to dump in that cash there when we could be spending the money on other renewables that already are economically competitive. At this point, solar and wind are behind only natural gas, and they're fast approaching the cost points for natural gas. They're already more effective cost-wise than coal and oil.
Hmm.
And that's what we need to be focused on. In the long run, if we get to like nuclear fusion, great. I mean, the Germans have been investing heavily on that. Fantastic. If somebody manages to crack the nut for nuclear fusion, then yeah, then nuclear can become viable again once it's inexpensive enough. Right now, it's nuclear fission is old technology. It produces waste that we're stuck with for tens of thousands of years. It has potential disasters that come along with it, and it's simply unaffordable. So why bother?
Okay. Okay. For on the nuclear stuff, I've heard different stuff. We don't have to go into specifics. I've heard that that like one of the reasons why nuclear is so expensive versus other energies is that there's a ton of subsidies that exist, even for things like fossil fuels still get a lot of subsidies. But I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. I do know that there has to be a way to deal with the with like temperature or rather weather variations, right? That like if it's not as windy, you don't get as much wind. If it's cloudy, you don't get as much solar. That there are these problems that still exist for some of those alternative energies, but
those, but see, that's not a matter of the energy at all.
mm-hmm.
The problem there is the national power grid. If we, and this is where again the investment that comes with the Green New Deal sort of thinking
Mm-hmm.
can be good for the economy as a whole. If we moved over to a smart power grid that with fast transmission lines, able to move the power to where it needs to go very quickly, and better storage technologies. So if we make the improvements in those two areas, a smart grid and better storage, and you don't have an issue with less sun and less wind. All this is possible. The Germans produce a fantastic amount of electricity from things like solar, and they're an extremely cloudy area. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they have massive cloud cover. We don't have cloud cover in large parts of this country. You could build massive solar arrays in large parts of the Southwest deserts,
Mm-hmm.
and with a smart grid, you're able to move that energy all across the country like that and respond to those needs.
Sure.
So
Although when you start
we simply
upgrading, yeah. Although when you start upgrading like a lot of those grids and you do more like storage and whatnot, we're talking about more like waste and everything and upfront costs, right, for disposing of this stuff or creating and disposing of old stuff.
Well, I mean, you're basically talking about an investment. Eventually, you have to replace things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't keep using the same old technology for something. At some point, you have to say, well, it's time to stop upgrading the coal plant and get off of coal. It's the same basic logic anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have to move off of these old techniques, replace the grid as a whole, and there's massive gains that you get from that.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, and taking apart the old power relay stations is not going to produce so much excessive waste that it isn't immediately like wiped out by the gains,
Mm-hmm.
by the much cleaner production and transmission of electricity that comes from the smart grid. So you're talking about short-term investments and long-term benefits.
Sure. Okay. The second thing that you brought up, I'm very interested in. So I used to be heavily against things like Citizens United, which is kind of what you're talking about when you talk about like money and politics. I had a very conservative friend that we'd go back and forth talking about this though, and one thing I wonder in terms of like getting money out of politics, and I don't expect you to have a perfect answer to this because I consider this a really complicated issue. Where do you draw the line in terms of how companies should be allowed to advertise to people or fund certain projects when it comes to like freedom of speech? So like as an example, say I have two candidates running in some district. One of them is pro, we'll say nuclear energy, and one is anti-nuclear energy. If I wanted to fund a huge documentary that is anti-nuclear energy and then put ads up for it, like how do you draw the line on what should be allowed or shouldn't be allowed for this type of stuff without it like infringing on like some pretty important like free speech issues?
All right, so let's see if I can try and understand what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Whose free speech are we talking about here?
So just any company or any individual wants to dump more than what the FEC would allow for like an individual like campaign contribution. Say somebody wants to spend $2 million, either a company or a person, on creating some documentary that is anti some issue that like a candidate is running on. Do you think that stuff like this should like be considered in terms of campaign contributions? Right. This is kind of like where super PACs come from, right? Where all of the money is funneled into a super PAC that kind of works on certain issues but doesn't directly work with a candidate. How do you go about like drawing lines on what should or shouldn't be allowed there?
I would say by understanding what free speech is, because allowing massive spending like that it violates free speech. It actually acts against it. And that's just some simple psychological tricks here. If someone has a massive amount of money, they can dump tons of cash in, and immediately sway arguments, because most of us don't spend a lot of time doing the research and all this. People don't study policies. They don't have time. They have jobs. They have kids. They're not going to do this. But if they see a cute little 30-second ad that gets them, oh, okay, and that name sticks in their head, or that little cute little line, the person getting the groceries out of the back of the car turns and says something to the camera, and you kind of like remember that. Oh, okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
And that then influences your voting. That's not free speech. That's propaganda. That's basically allowing people to buy votes and manipulate people. Advertising for products, okay, there's a certain speech there's a certain market logic. Let people spend the money to sell their goods, but letting them spend their money to sell public policy that affects all of us, to me, it's basically allowing the wealthy to control society completely.
Aren't we
that's
like
that's not democratic, and it's not about freedom of speech. It's literally creating an aristocracy of wealth.
Mm-hmm. Aren't we kind of in an area though where like pretty much, so like even if we look at like some of Michael Moore's works, right? Like I think he did like Fahrenheit 9/11 and like other movies like this. Would these be seen as forms of like political advertisement, or like what Sacha Baron Cohen does, the guy that did Borat, and then more recently, I think This Is America. I don't know.
Are those ads or documentaries? I mean, if someone is producing a documentary film and says, "Hey, here's my cool idea. Go check that out. I've made this cool documentary film that says coal is good for you. Coal is great. Come see my film," and put that out. That's fine. They can do that. I don't see a problem with them doing that. It's when they can pay for deceptive, literally lying 30-second ads, dump $10 million and have them pop up in everyone's YouTube feed, and they're seeing, "Oh, coal is good. Oh, coal is good." Right? It's a different issue for me.
So do you think they should be allowed?
So for speech, the connection of films like Michael Moore, to me, that's a lot more like someone funding an art installation or something, or like contributing something in the public sphere. If someone wants to put the material out there, fund a museum, fund an exhibit somewhere in a museum, produce documentaries or something, that's fine. That's then expressing a perspective and putting it into the debate in the public sphere. Mm-hmm. Advertising, because of the psychological dimensions of it, and because of the way it sort of works within consumer economies, is actually kind of dangerous when it's dealing with areas of public policy. There's a reason that no other country in the world does it this way. We're the only one that has these kind of problem with that kind of advertising, and it's directly why we're so much more corrupt in that sense too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess. So is the only issue you have then on like advertising the documentaries you make, or because like, so for Citizens United, for instance, like I'm pretty sure that was like I think that was a conservative group that just wanted to air a documentary about Hillary Clinton. It was kind of an attack documentary, whatever, and they wanted to run ads for it. I guess I try to look at it on the other side. So like if Trump was running for re-election and a bunch of people got together and they wanted to make like a $10 million movie related to Trump or whatever to showcase some of the bad things about him, it feels hard to say like how would you allow something like that but then not allow people to pool their money for other issues, whether it's fossil fuel or pro or anti-climate change or pro or anti-abortion or whatever. It just seems really hard to kind of like figure out like what should be allowed or shouldn't be allowed there.
Yeah, and this is where you said it is a difficult issue, and I honestly have a harder time justifying restricting advertising for productions like that, because you can at least make the argument that this has some artistic value or something, or it's some kind of contribution to the discussion, and view it a little bit differently. Where I would push a little on that is sort of shifting the ground and think about where the money is coming from in the first place and the degree to which you can spend. So this is where I kind of like limitations on spending for things. The idea of super PACs, where you can spend unlimited amounts of money producing something. So I want to convince people that coal is good for you, and I'm willing to spend $100 million to do that because I know I'm going to get a few $1 billion in profit from it. The person who has $100 million, he has more speech. And the person who's standing there with the scientific research and the piles of information and the low budget documentary that says coal is bad for you, now gets drowned out by $100 million.
Sure.
So for me, it's the spending limits are the key issue there. If someone wants to advertise some piece of trash Dinesh D'Souza film, that's fine. There should be a budget for that says they can't spend $100 million trying to drive everyone in to see this garbage.
Sure.
Because it's restricting the individual businesses, the individual wealthy person, the individual corporations' ability to sway things. It's setting hard limits on how much cash. There's a reason that we did that for individual voters too. Elections should be funded by voters directly because they're supposed to represent us, not corporations. But you're limited to like $2,700. There's a good reason for that, because I don't want the local millionaire to buy politicians.
Yeah.
So why don't we have that same $2,700 limit? I mean, why are there not limits on corporate donations? Why do we have these super PACs? Super PACs should not exist. They are nakedly corrupt. It's the 21st century version of what we used to do in the 19th century. Walk onto the floor of the House of Representatives with an envelope stuffed with cash. That's all it is, and it just simply should not be allowed.
Sure. Okay, so for domestic issues, you had it was climate change, and then kind of the funding of elections, like Citizens United issues.
Well, you're saying like what are a couple of big issues that I would like
people to talk about.
Yeah.
So okay, I'm more interested in this because of your history background. For foreign policy issues, what do you think are things? So most Americans, I don't think, know anything or even have an interest really in what we do in terms of foreign policy. If you could think of like one or two like big either Trump administration blunders or Obama administration blunders, like what are a couple things in terms of foreign policy that we should be paying more attention to, or you think people should be paying more attention to that we really don't right now?
Oh boy, and this is a trick for me, and it's actually funny. One of the reasons my campaign manager got in this in the first place was my foreign policy background, and she was saying, "Yeah, you should totally be in politics for this." But it's realistically a hard thing to run on because not only do most Americans not know much about the rest of the world or what we do in it, most of them don't care.
Yeah, because it doesn't impact our daily lives, right? Yeah.
Right. It's a lot harder to make them care about it because, yeah, while we're spending ridiculous amounts of money on the military and whatnot, it still, doesn't seem like it's hurting them directly. I mean, it is to some extent, but it's a bit more abstract. And when you have to start making references to particular events or people or places that they've never heard of, then their eyes glaze over and you've lost it. So it's
really
hard.
One thing that I thought was really funny was, do you remember when Gary Johnson got nailed on that Aleppo comment a few years ago? People made fun of him and laughed at him, but to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if 95% of Americans had no idea who Aleppo was, what Aleppo was, if that was a historical event, if it happened to be a city. That was.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Where it was fair to nail him was that it had been discussed repeatedly for weeks in the press.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm not giving him a side on it, but a lot of Americans seem really disconnected from stuff going on in the Middle East. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Most Americans, and realistically, most Americans should be. I don't want most Americans to have to know this sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't make sense that we all have to have the same level of knowledge of these different places and events. But we have to count on an informed media that's willing to engage and discuss these issues fairly, and realistically, ours does a terrible job. And we have to have public intellectuals and politicians willing to talk about these issues. They need to be the ones that are bringing them up and saying this, that, and the other thing. And frequently, what we have in politics is a bunch of uninformed idiots repeating what they saw in memes and highly biased talking points, and they have no idea what they're talking about. Most of our foreign policy appears to be directed by idiots, from my perspective. And I think that we do need to push back hard on a lot of these issues. The Iran one is a good one for me. There's no realistic reason for Iran to be an enemy to the United States. It's simply inertia. We've been pushing them so hard, they keep pushing us back, and it just keeps going and going. At some point, we should stand back and say, why are we doing this? Our populations actually have a lot in common. You're growing steadily more progressive, certainly much more progressive than most of the Arab world. You have a space program and a highly diversified economy. Why can't we be friends? There are good reasons to be friendly to them and no real reasons to oppose them internationally, because they're not doing things like our friends, the Saudis, are directly contributing to a lot of like Sunni jihadist terror. There's still not a single Iranian terrorist that's gone out there and blown himself up. It hasn't happened. But we use the fact that it's another Muslim country in the Middle East and whip people up in it, because what it does is it simply fuels the military-industrial complex, and it fuels the constant spending, and it keeps us worried and afraid of somebody, and it keeps us in the area, and next thing you know, we're fighting somebody else's war. The Saudis don't like the Iranians. That's fine. Let the Saudis deal with it. It's their problem. If we stopped selling the Saudis tons of weapons, and the Saudis have a ridiculously high military budget specifically because they're kissing our asses. They're spending tons of money here. But, why? Why are we fueling that? Why are we handing them weapons so they can commit war crimes in Yemen? We don't talk about Yemen. The fact that massive starvations and outbreaks of disease are coming directly as a result of the things that the Saudis are choosing to bomb with our weapons is not talked about, to me is inhuman. The fact that we've rolled over on the Syria issue. We've let Assad kill 500,000 people, and we keep talking about it like the terrorists were the thing. Yes, okay, the Islamic State people, they're horrifying, right? Al-Nusra Front, all these terrorist groups are acting horrifying people, but there's still a matter of scale. They killed a few thousand people. He killed 400 plus thousand. And we don't want to talk about that because radical Islam sells better in the media, and it keeps people worried more, and it justifies the military-industrial complex. For me, a lot of it does come back to this. I mean, I connect a lot of issues.
Okay.
And a lot of it does come back to the way that we spend and the massive corruption. The fact that we allow these corporations essentially to buy politicians, spread the jobs across all 50 states, so it's difficult to cancel any projects without affecting jobs. And then once you have that equipment, someone in office is going to say, I can use this toy and blow up such and such. You said, okay, picking on Obama. I'm perfectly happy to pick on Obama. He assassinated a U.S. citizen abroad. I mean, that's just what? Hello, what happened to due process? Yeah, he was a bad guy, but he was a U.S. citizen, and we killed him with a drone strike. He had drones operating in more than half a dozen countries. Granted, Trump has done worse, but Obama did worse than W. Bush did. You put the toys there, and you take away any accountability. That the spending that they authorized in the wake of 9/11, no one has been able to revoke a line that said the president is allowed to go wherever the hell he wants in the world and shoot terrorists with no oversight at all. I mean, it is the most irresponsible thing ever, and it's why Trump has got troops in 8 countries. We're just able to do whatever we want, and if we keep spending, then that feeds into what the corporations want in the first place, keeps us constantly at war. We are killing people. If people are worried about terrorism, and sure, there's an emotional response. I can see you're worried about terrorism. You don't want someone to come in and shoot something up in the U.S. I totally get that. Do you want to stop? Take American troops out of these other countries and stop attacking them.
Okay.
Why do we have troops in most of these countries in the Middle East? There's no reason for it. It does not make us safer. It makes us less safe.
All right, I got an easy question, and then I got a hard question. We don't have to go too into it. I'm super curious in your opinion. So for the joint comprehensive plan of action, I think was the Iran deal, right?
Yep.
Did you think that was largely like a successful deal? Should we have pulled out of that in the way that Trump did, or?
No, it was successful. First off, it's debatable whether Iran was ever going to produce a nuclear weapon anyway, especially since they publicly been saying no, and the supreme leader had said it would be un-Islamic to have a nuclear weapon, and they are a signatory to the non-proliferation treaty. But they do have a strategic reason to get a nuclear weapon, the same reason North Korea did. Right? Why did we keep talking about Iraq and invading Iraq and not talking about invading North Korea? Because North Korea had the bomb, and they could drop one in Seoul. So it actually worked. It makes him safer. So there's a good strategic reason for them. So we can't discount that someone might want to do it. So the deal actually did cut down on their ability to do so. It was being monitored. It was effective. The U.S. government's own intelligence agencies and the State Department said they are perfectly in compliance.
As did independent, I think UN investigators did as well.
The UN did this. The Europeans did this. Everyone verified that they were fully in compliance with this, and it would not have led to it. And what it could have done, and what was intended to do, was to help to reset relations and get us talking again. Because realistically, there's no good reason for Iran to be an enemy of the U.S. Okay. There's a bad history there, but we should start trying to talk again. Shutting that down was intended specifically to bolster the hardliners, to harm Rouhani's government, and to make the Iranian government more hostile to the U.S., which then justifies the military spending and our aggressive posture in the area and propping up what the Saudis want to do. It's dirty. There was the reason that the American people were given was a lie.
Sure.
The Iran deal was working, and it could have improved relations. But the people who don't want to improve relations, who want to keep relations bad so we can maintain an aggressive posture in the area, that's why they scrapped it.
Sure. Okay, so now a harder question. I'm very curious. So we talk about dethroning somebody like Assad. So I'm very curious, understanding kind of like this geopolitical landscape where you have these... I don't want to say Russian puppets, but these factions that are friendly to Russia. So Iran, that kind of props up groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, and then Syria, right, that gives access to its ports to Russia and everything. How do we move in, or how do you deal with somebody like Assad, and not expect Russia to step in or China to step in, and even Turkey along that border had interests there as well. How do you navigate these treacherous scenarios where there are so many different interests that are vying at one another, and never directly either, right? Because Turkey's shooting down Russian planes that are flying over, that are trying to bomb proxy groups that we're funding. How do you even begin to deal with issues like these that are so entangled with each other?
Yeah, some of them get really complex. The Syrian one actually is extremely complex. I've actually been teaching courses on the Arab revolutions for years, trying to explain, at least give people some basics on this. But it's an extraordinarily complicated issue.
Yeah.
Some of them, there are tons of things we can do, but I'm not generally in favor of the whole regime change type of thing. I don't think we need to be in the business of killing bad people. What we should have been doing, though, is discouraging other players from getting involved so that we don't turn these things into proxy wars. The fact that Turkey has invaded Syria on multiple occasions, that's on us. They would not have done that if we did not allow them to do so. Because Turkey is a NATO ally and is tied in to the US to the US system that helps to kind of maintain the security in Europe and all that. It gives us a significant amount of influence there. We've turned a blind eye to them, and they're doing it only for domestic politics so they can justify shooting their own Kurds. It's a ridiculous situation there. But we empower some of these actors. The same thing with our aggressive posture towards Iran actually encourages Iranian activities there because they want to maintain bases in the only friendly Arab country. Syria's been the only country that's been friendly to Iran since the revolution, and they're determined to hold on to that. And we put them on the defensive and make it look like we're going after Assad. They're going to step in. That, of course, gets the Israelis involved. Next thing you know, the Israelis are shooting Iranians both in Syria and now more recently in Iraq. And they can only do that if we allow them to do it. The simple fact is we could say, dude, we totally know you're about to blow something in Iraq, and you're going to stop doing that right now. But we don't. We allow these things to escalate because it plays into our perceived interest, at least amongst the elites, of propping up the military spending and our aggressive posture in the area and maintaining enemies that can justify the whole nasty kit and caboodle. We should have taken a step back from all these things. There are tons of ways that economically and politically we could have supported and empowered the kind of resistance movements that could honestly make a huge difference in the world. What's been happening in Tunisia, I think, is a great model there. They didn't have to deal with a military intervention, and we've been providing some support, some civilian support, help with them to organize, parliament type stuff, and helping to encourage the development of a stable democracy, but only where they ask. And it actually is helping to get that democracy to take root. Yeah, outside powers can play a part in helping to encourage the right things. Realistically, we have tended to encourage the opposite. We actually initially opposed the collapse of Ben Ali's government there, as well as the collapse of Mubarak government in Egypt. Initially, we're we like our dictators. What are you talking about? But as soon as it looked like the dictators were in trouble, we found somebody else to support. I think that we're too often on the side of the reactionaries in the region.
Gotcha. I guess you seem like you know the history of the regions better than me. It seems more like less than siding with the reactionaries. It's more just whoever will defend American interests at the end of the day. So, for instance, why we kept Saddam Hussein where he was we didn't really care much about the war crimes of the Kurds, but it was the fact that he would remain loyal to the U.S. over Russia, for instance. Yeah.
Right. Or what are perceived by some people to be American interests, because again, none of this is actually an American interest at all.
Well, America in terms of Americans' very specific foreign policy interests, not the average guy that works in it. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean the interests of the military-industrial complex and the lobbyists and all, and the people who are actually running the Defense Department and all that. It's in their interests, sure. But I mean, 9/11 was a response to U.S. actions. It wasn't unprovoked. It was a horrifying attack. It's completely unjustifiable. We have to condemn that, and we needed to prosecute the people for doing it. But it was a criminal act in response to something that we've been doing for a long time, and our response was to double down and do more of it. And that will have consequences too. There will be more terrorist attacks. We are making Americans all around the world and here less safe by doing this. And if we can get people at least to understand that we're making ourselves less safe, I think it can help there, because especially the conservative voters and whatnot are more concerned by safety and security. They're afraid of things. They're afraid of what's going on there. Okay, cool. You're afraid? Fine. This is how we make us safer and how we actually avoid causing these problems in the first place.
For sure. Okay, so
as far as you mentioned the area specifically, I think I think it disclaimer, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually a historian in the Middle East by training, so.
Gotcha. Or yeah, well, yeah, I say it on your website. Everything is mentioned pretty often. So, okay, stepping back from hairy Middle Eastern issues. Oh well, I'm curious. Before we move too much further west, do you have a general opinion or view of everything going on? This is not related to voters at all. I'm sorry, but like of the Brexit issue in the United Kingdom, or Boris Johnson suspending Parliament or anything.
I actually closely follow politics in a dozen European countries,
Mm-hmm.
so I mean, I could talk about issues and domestic issues in quite a few of them. I certainly have opinions on what's been going on there, but realistically, there's not much any of us can do about it.
Mm-hmm. I guess something I'm really interested in is it felt like leading up to Brexit, it felt like a lot of the same issues that were being echoed by kind of like the British everyman was pretty similar to a lot of the issues that were echoed by the the American manufacturer or blue collar worker. The idea that globalism happens, some sector of the economy has been totally left behind, the political elites are out of touch with us, and here's how we're going to get you back. And in the UK, they did it with Brexit. In the US, we did it with Trump. Do you kind of see like any mirrored, I guess, sentiments there between populations, or?
There is, and what we're dealing with here is across the developed countries a resurgence of right populism that is actually a response to people who are out of touch and don't talk to ordinary workers. I mean, the simple fact is, Democrats in this country and the liberal types and left types in a lot of other European countries, they don't talk to ordinary workers, and they don't go out to rural areas, and they don't try to explain the issues in ways that make sense to people. They cede that ground to reactionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And people are then able to walk in and say, oh, are you tired of the foreigners in the area? Oh, yeah, there's a Polish restaurant that opened up next door, and it's got weird letters on the wall, and that makes me uncomfortable. Cool. That's because of the European Union. We should get out of that. There'll be no more Polacks in your street. Oh, okay, cool. And then you'll vote for that. It's basically a reaction to what are natural and long-term trends developing in the economy and in international relations, but we have not done a good job on messaging those. We've not done a good job of selling them, and there is in the European Union a significant, the common phrase for it is a democracy deficit. They don't actually do a good job of reaching out to people, explaining what they're doing, and making it look transparent and democratic. Instead, it looks like elites are shoving something down your throat, and you don't like it. And that's something that the right can very easily exploit, and it's what's happening in Britain there. And in the U.S., it also happens in Germany, in Sweden, in Hungary, in Poland, in Italy. I mean, these reactionary movements are all over the place.
Are all getting quite popular. Yeah,
they're all and they can all build on anti-immigrant hysteria. Look at like the anti-Muslim hysteria in places like the Netherlands or France.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's pushing people away from the policies that have actually made them richer and safer. I mean, it wiped out the possibility of war on the European mainland,
mm-hmm.
and it integrated the economies in such a way that everyone's standard of living went up. I mean, we tend to forget that in the 1950s, most houses in France did not have a toilet. They didn't have running water. I mean, the level of actual infrastructure in these countries was quite weak, and not just because of World War II. It had never been built in the first place. It just had not been done. The integration allowed for tons of investment in different areas that directly bettered everyone's lives. And we're trying to throw that away because people are afraid. And the answer to that is for more people to stand up and explain the stuff well, and try to just walk into the pool halls and talk to ordinary people and try to help them understand that they're actually safer and richer.
Yeah, I remember seeing even hysteria in the U.S. over refugees, when I think we've had almost 1 million referred and I think there was only one terrorist attack ever, and it wasn't even a terrorist attack. It was the FBI finding people in, it was like Minnesota or something, where they wanted to fund a group overseas.
There was some Iraqi or something.
Yeah, something like that.
On that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah.
Some of the safest groups of people that get some of the most intense screening of any American to ever be settled here. Yeah, it's insane. Yeah.
Immigrants and refugees have statistically far lower crime rates.
Mm-hmm.
Far lower crime rates than native-born Americans. I mean, 3/4 of terrorist attacks in the U.S. are coming from the right, and they're domestic terror attacks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and people blaming the foreigners for that, blaming immigrants, blaming refugees for that, that's simply a reaction. And honestly, it's a reaction not just to what's happening in the world, not just to globalization and, the movement of refugees and everything else here. It's not just that. It's also a reaction to how out of touch a lot of people on the left have gotten.
Yeah.
and how unwilling they are to talk to ordinary people. Democrats used to dominate the heartland of this country when we talked about working class issues in relatable ways, and we tried to reach out to people and show them we're making your lives better. And by taking a step back and just shaming people, look at the reaction of people always saying like, "Oh, you're virtue signaling this and that." I mean, they have kind of a point that we're not really trying very hard
Yeah,
to reach out.
actually, that one of the biggest missing the marks I'd ever seen was in the 2016 election cycle. Trump and Bernie had kind of tapped into this populist mindset that people feel disenfranchised, that people feel like they're not being heard. And Trump had his campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again." And I remember Hillary coming out on stage and be like, "America's already great," and it's like, some people think that, but you're missing everybody that doesn't already buy into that, which is like all the people that
Right.
Bernie and Trump were targeting. And it's like, oh, how could you miss the mark this hard?
Right. The people who were hurt, right? And Moore was right about, Trump's viability in the Midwest. I called the 2016 race as a toss-up just because it was going to be decided by so few voters in only a handful of swing states.
Yep. I think it
The
was like
fact that she wouldn't
15,000 voters, I think, more or
Yeah.
less decided it between some swing states.
The fact that she wasn't even competing in those areas bothered me. But it's not just that she didn't go there. It was her. I mean, and I don't mean her in the sense of like, well, there's all the propaganda and people didn't like her. And yes, she was personally very unpopular, but so was he. The key issue here is that she didn't run on her platform. She ran on not being Trump.
Yeah.
She ran as a milquetoast centrist in a time when populism was appealing to people and people felt scared and insecure and worried about the future. And she said, "Oh, it's all good. We'll be fine. Vote for me because I'm not a raging douchebag. This guy seems unfit. He's yelling and screaming and calling people names, and I'm not like that. Vote for me." I was like, well, him doing that was tapping into some anger in the same way that Bernie's like mussed up here, kind of ranting at the 1% also taps into that anger. And a lot of those people just didn't show up.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a big study in 2017 that showed about 12% of Bernie's primary voters actually voted for Trump in the general. And that doesn't mean that they were like all hardcore racists or something. It was because they're like, screw this. If the Democrats aren't going to listen to me, they're not going to take my concerns seriously, and they're going to keep shoving this stuff down my throat, then yeah, I'll throw a spanner in the works and you get Trump. We need to actually get back to talking to ordinary people and addressing their concerns. If we talk down to them, if we basically shame the Trump voters, and I see a lot of Democrats doing this, candidates for office and ordinary Democrats, attacking the Trump voters as terrible people. Some of them,
basket of
yes,
deplorables,
very much are.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of them are. Well, let's be fair. There are some deplorable elements in Trump's
There's
coalition.
a lot of moderates in there that you can't ignore. Yeah.
But exactly, there's also tons of swing voters. There's tons of simple populists. There's tons of people who said, hey, I'm a working class voter. I'm concerned about how I can pay my bills. And this guy's saying he'll help, and maybe he'll do it. Nobody else has helped. Everything, and it's been getting worse steadily. I mean, we've been in decline for 40 years, and it's a bipartisan issue. None of them have stopped that decline. And Trump is saying, I'm the outsider. I'll change things. I'll make things better. There are people who are tempted to say, well, maybe it'll happen. Why not? I'll take a shot at it. And if we basically lump all of them together and say that they're all just horrible people, we're kind of missing the point of what made him viable in the first place.
So this is kind of a broader discussion that I've had on my stream recently. When you talk about moving, this is kind of a pulling back, doing like a more broad sense. So we have our, ironically enough, Hillary talked about this. You have kind of your like ideologically purist position. Like this is the ideal America, and maybe for some people it's a socialist state. For some people it's a highly democratized, much more social safety nets and everything. For some people it's something completely different. When you envision this, is your goal, how do you balance out like kind of your pragmatic policy positions versus this is what I actually want, right? Like say I actually want like the single payer extreme Bernie plan, but instead I'm just gonna incrementally build on the ACA. How do you figure out like which positions you should adopt in a public facing manner?
For me, most of that is based more around the data than anything else. So on the healthcare issue, I don't like the idea of trying to like prop up the ACA because I think it's a waste of money. If you're trying to maintain some kind of hybrid system, you don't actually solve the problem of Americans paying twice as much as anyone else. You're actually just adding a cost because then you're dividing up those risk pools and you dramatically increase the amount of spending there. And the point is to decrease the amount of spending. And there are different ways to do it. Medicare is not the only way to do it. It is possible to actually accomplish it with an entirely private system. The Dutch and German systems are completely private, and yet They're vastly more efficient and cheaper than ours is. I think, and the British system is actually completely state-run. So there are a whole range of competing models here. I tend to like the Medicare one because it leaves all providers completely private. The hospitals, the doctors, the suppliers, everything, and simply replaces only the insurance, which is something that nobody realistically cares about. It's just the faceless bean counters in the offices somewhere, like checking the box.
Mm-hmm.
And if everyone has a good plan, it's done. That to me is, I think, the simplest and cheapest way to do it. But there are other ways to do it. And I'm open to all the discussions there. What I don't want is to pursue a system that is going to increase the cost for no particular reason, because that was one of the flaws in the ACA. When they took the public option out of the ACA and they made the mandate so weak that the penalty was so weak, it encouraged tons of healthy people to stay out of the network entirely. So they weren't in those risk pools. They just paid the tax penalty instead, which of course gets them angry. Yeah. And it makes people angry. I just got another tax for no particular reason, blah, blah, blah. And then that's going to piss them off. But it kept them out of those risk pools. And you didn't have the competitive pressure of the public option. Those two things are what caused the healthcare cost to rise steadily for many people. Some of us saved money. I saved money. A lot of people did not. Healthcare costs went up, and they're going to continue to go up. And if we stay on that kind of system, they will continue to climb, and they need to go down. As far as the general point about balancing where you want to be versus what you have to do today, because I'm by nature a very progressive person, but I'm pragmatic, and I think one of the things that helps to drive that is simply my background as a historian. I'm accustomed to seeing change over time. I know that things get better. When people are always like, "Oh, back in the good old days," I'm like, "Really, the good old days? Would you like me to tell you about the good old days? Because they were
my
shitty."
Favorite talking point is when somebody brings up the good old days. I always want to ask, like, which ones are they talking about? You mean when women couldn't vote, when black people couldn't go to white schools? But which one? When gay marriage was illegal?
Well, when we had cholera and polio. Which good old day are you talking about here?
Yeah.
Things are bad for us in many ways, right? And it is true that the middle class has shrunk from 70% of the population to 50%. It is true that wages have been stagnant for 40 years. But in many respects, we're still better off than we would have been. People are still healthier overall and living longer than they lived in 1950. Our lifespans are falling. They have inched down a little bit here, but they're still higher than they were in 1950. So, like, what good old days, What we need to do is change the course of it, change the direction so we can get back onto a nice upward trajectory. And I think the goal for me is simply to be on the right path. So, do I eventually want something like a post-scarcity Star Trek kind of a system where I can just go to the replicator and here's my sweater or something? Yeah, and I think we'll get there. But do I think that we need to sort of like be there tomorrow? No, because I know we're going to. Think if you get on the right path, if you can show people that this is the right direction based on the data, based on the history, based on the numbers, this is where we need to be going here, we will get to those points.
Okay. That's about it for like major questions I have. Are there any other issues, I guess, that you feel like are important or that you want to address or talk about, or?
Let's see. Sure. There's the sort of basic thing. My campaign manager is trans, and I'm supposed to say trans rights or something. So,
okay.
I obviously have very socially liberal values and all that. So, I'm all for expanding civil rights, so that shows up there as an issue too. So, and all that. But I think that, I guess one thing that I want to point out, it gets back to some of these basic points we've been making all along here. I want to be able to go anywhere, talk to anybody, and try to contribute to the national conversation here. I want to help push us in the right direction. I don't want to be another one of these generic, faceless politicians with nice scripted talking points that just sticks to safe stuff. I want to walk in and talk to anybody and actually try to contribute to these conversations. And I want to do that with clean money, which we've been doing. And so obviously I have to make the pitch and say, please donate to us. It's one of those, I guess one cute way I like to say it is like, for the price of a coffee a month, you can basically be providing, effective government that's going to be accountable only to the people and not to corporate interests. if we all kind of step up and do that, and I know I've been supporting House campaigns across the country where I've seen somebody, I think this person would do a good job, and here's your $5 a month, and help out there. If we can all pitch in a little bit more. So if people want to hop onto my website, like liamomera.org, check out some of the other positions I've taken, check out some of the events. We regularly update where we're going. We oftentimes record things. There's little videos of me contributing places, and you can hop onto ActBlue from there and help us.
Have you done any on the ground events so far in California? I don't know if it's too early.
We've done a lot, actually. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of events, and not everything gets added on there. We try to pick out major ones. So, public events where I show up at different rallies or events there, or club events and club speeches. We obviously were at the Democratic Party's conference up in San Francisco recently. So there's tons of things like that, and we're showing a bit more and more of those kind of things, and trying to set up also, and that's not the kind of thing that easily shows up on the website, but we're setting up tons of small scale meet and greets where basically, okay, so Liam's going to be hanging out at such and such a bar down there, come on down and chat, and people can come in and talk to me, because I want to meet as many people as I can, and I'm going to be fearless about this. I'll go anywhere. I'll go to the Chamber of Commerce, the Moose Lodge. I'll walk in anywhere and talk to people and try to make the case that my policies will make them richer, that my policies will make them better off. And we need people's support to help make that possible. Another thing we're trying to do as well is improve some of the social media game and some of the video things. If we can produce, a nice videos that basically take a complex policy position and boil it down to 45 to 60 seconds and help people understand it in a different way than they might have heard it before. That can also help to change things, and not just in the district and swaying votes there, but can also help to push some of the conversation nationally on some of these big issues.
Okay, cool. I mean, we've got your website listed and everything. Is there an upcoming event that you're planning on doing soon that maybe people could find you at? Or I don't know if you normally broadcast these online, or... I'm not actually sure. There's I always try to announce things on the social media accounts when important things are coming up. There's let's see, no, there's an endorsement vote coming up. I rely on people to keep the calendar for me, because it's one of those fun ironies of me being a historian. Is if I'm not actually looking down at something, I have no idea what day it is. I'm terrible at dates. Okay. Final question then, because the chat really wants to know, which Linux distro do you use and why?
Okay, so I've used quite a few over the years. I was a Unix user beforehand, and I transitioned to Linux on my desktop in '95. And back then it was throwing things together with Slackware, and I was an early Red Hat user and kind of playing around with that. And I've gone through quite a few over the years. I have tended to favor more the Debian variants. And my current laptop is based on Mint, because it's easier to configure some of the multimedia stuff and get it to at least tolerably handle my hardware without tons of tinkering. But I still strip it down. It's running XFCE because I prefer performance to flashy bells and whistles.
Okay. Do you know who Richard Stallman is?
Yeah. No, I've actually met RMS.
Oh, wow. Okay. We were really close to getting an interview with him, but we couldn't get the free software program that he wanted to use to work, so we couldn't end up doing it. But yeah, that's cool.
No, he's a big time weirdo. No, but no, I was heavily involved in the geek community years ago. I mean, I was on the internet in the 80s before the web existed. Sure. I used to play on MUDs, and go around. So,
I grew up playing them. I type very quickly now just because of that. But,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So okay, I was always remoting into some remote Unix server, and I started getting used to working from computers that way, and that just stayed sort of normal for me. So I never adapted to the whole Windows or Mac stuff.
Sure. Okay, well, hey, that's awesome. I'm really glad you came to talk. I appreciate it. Hopefully I can brag and say that I talked to a future congressman if you win the nomination and get through and win the election. Yeah.
And I because we're using some of her equipment here, I want to plug Aidan Wood's Twitch stream as well. So it's twitch.tv and then AIDANWOULD, Aidan Wood.
Wait, twitch.tv
AIDAN WOULD. Would you?
Aidan Wood. Gotcha.
Aidan Wood.
Oh, yeah, I see him in my chat right now. Oh, that's me.
Yeah,
cool.
There you go.
Awesome.
So, Yeah, throw a little plug there, is helping out here. Me coming from a rural area with no good internet, I want to be doing more of this, but I have to get some help to set up, and I'm stealing her internet right now. So,
Gotcha. Cool. Well, hey, I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, and good luck on your election and everything. Yeah.
yeah, thanks very much, and please remember to check us out if anyone's interested in anything I've had to say here, and please hop on and donate. But thanks very much, and thank you very much for your time. I've appreciated this.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye.
Right now because it's the Democratic primaries, but I feel like I've spent I never really wanted to get into an issue.